Hello, everyone. My name is Brenda Lewis with the Tulsa Regional Chamber. Welcome to this segment of the Build program, which is a series of webinars aimed at providing education and resources to small business owners and their growing team of leaders. The presenting sponsors for the Build program are the Persimmon Group and Security Bank. Thank you so much to these sponsors for making the Build program possible. An additional thank you for their generous support is to our small business benefactors who support and make the program of work possible for the Small Business Connection. Those are Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oklahoma, TEDC Creative Capital, and Tulsa Federal Credit Union. Today's segment of the Build program is entitled Hiring, Firing, and Everything in Between, which will feature the expertise of Erica Dorwart, Executive Committee member of Frederic Dorwart Lawyers, PLLC. Erica, thank you so much for joining us. I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to help the Tulsa Chamber and the small businesses in Tulsa. Our firm, Frederic Dorwart Lawyers, PLLC, is absolutely committed to the mission of Tulsa and expanding our community and particularly small businesses here. What we'd like to do today is provide an employment primer for you. It's really a series of red flags that just cause you to ask the question, wait, do I have an employee issue? What should I do? Do I have time to think about it? And where might I find the answers? So we have a lot of resources that we'll provide to you. And this is really upper level. We only have 30 minutes, but it's good hands-on advice for employers to learn how to manage their employees and when to just take a moment, take a pause, and find the right answer or the right resource. With that, we'll begin sharing our screen. We have some materials for you that you may want to find helpful. So there's two questions I would tell you that are helpful every day. If you ever have an employee issue, there is absolutely nothing wrong with the phrase, how can I help you? And listening to the response. There's also nothing wrong with answering with, let me review your situation. It might take me a minute to get back to you, so that you do take the time to look for resources and manage those. This presentation is not provided for legal advice, but it is for informational purposes and to help you get to the right resources and just recognize when you do need to find a resource. Our agenda today is broken into 4 different sections. The first is recruiting and onboarding, which I can't stress the importance enough of. If you lay your eyes on the right employee and find them when you're looking at candidates, you shouldn't have to deal with sections 2 and 3 as much. And hopefully you'll avoid those by doing good recruiting and good onboarding, sharing expectations. The second piece of our agenda will be employee engagement and expectations. And then the third piece is performance management when you do run into any issues. And then finally, there are some resources at the back that we'll talk about where to go to find the easy advice that you can online. So the first, again, recruiting and onboarding. It's really important to get to know your candidates at the outset of your process. We can't stress enough in our office that having a really good position description so that both you and the potential employee candidate know what is expected from the job at the very out front, from posting to onboarding and interviewing and then managing that performance. One thing we think is fairly critical to avoid tripping up is as positions change, as duties change over time, making sure that you're looking at least once a year at the position description to make sure that it matches what the employee is doing, both from meeting goals perspectives and saying, well, if you're doing something else, I need to make it an essential function on your position description. Why they're important. It gives the employee a clear expectation of what they're required to do. It allows the employer to hold that employee to the position description. If you have a problem, look at it. If the employee isn't doing something that you think they should be doing, see if it's in their position description. It should be if you're annually reviewing those. Then for Americans with Disabilities Act purposes, the first question anybody usually asks in a disabilities case is, was that duty an essential function of that position? So making sure everybody knows that essential function at the beginning is really helpful. For purposes of Oklahoma Marijuana Act issues, if you're going to classify a position as safety sensitive and you can't have any marijuana use going on, then you need to have that in the position description up front. Check to see if those duties are truly safety sensitive. And then it helps employers in defining their wage and hour Fair Labor Standards Act classifications as to whether someone's overtime eligible or not overtime eligible. So those are just kind of a checklist of things that you want to make sure you have in your position descriptions and places that we use those position descriptions when looking at issues with employees. We've provided sort of a sample position description, but again, what are the qualities you need in an employee? What are those essential functions? And what skills are necessary? And designing that at the out front will help you find the right employee, and it'll help the employee know what they need to be doing when they're in their position. Initial screening is really important. We look at that, and a lot of employers are focused now on some criminal activities with lots of new what they're called ban the box laws. So the question is how early in your process are you going to ask somebody about their background? Usually it's best to get to know the employee first and know that position description so you know what job duties are important, and then ask that after you've made a conditional offer. So your offer is going to be subject to a background check and a Fair Reporting Act check. But that way you have not screened out an employee early based on a bias if it's not necessary for the position. And we also provided in here some links that are in the presentation, just making sure that you're eliminating your bias at the out front when you're conducting an interview, whether it's a bias you might have that that can't be allowed and is prohibited in the employment law against race, age, gender, whether an employee is pregnant or not. You might want to make sure you're educating yourself to identify where you may have some implicit biases and drop those so that you are getting the best employee for that position. Then the interview process itself. We usually like to say add 2 eyes on each candidate because it just gives you a second view. You may think that seeing someone in a remote interview and just one person laying eyes on them gives you a snapshot of a person. It's not the necessary snapshot you need. So we like to have different views. Maybe you see something going on with that person and someone else sees something differently. So you have good opinions when you have kind of a team-based. Questions during an interview, base those questions on job criteria. If it's not something that's in the position description, you probably shouldn't be asking that question because you really should be focusing on, can this potential candidate do the work? The other thing about questions is when you have candidates in a pool that you're looking at for a potential position, make sure you're asking similar questions of each candidate. That gives you a better view overall of how to compare them. We do suggest you conduct interviews in private but accessible locations and make sure they're ADA compliant. When we say ADA, we mean the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended, because whether it applies or a state law applies, you don't want to have barriers to employment access, even in the interview process. It is okay up front to ask people about their restrictions on employment. For example, did this person sign a non-compete clause? Did they sign a non-solicitation clause so they can't call on potential customers from their former employee? Do they have availability issues? Can they not be employed until the summer? Can they not move into town, until later? Do they have any location issues, whether you're going remote, which we're all doing a lot more of these days, or whether you're working in office? And then in your interviews, just understand the laws that are enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the various states at the very beginning of that recruiting process, whether it means you don't discriminate based on age, race, gender, religion, disability, and or genetic information. Those laws start being enforced at the very first time that you work with a candidate. So be aware of those. A lot of people don't think those start until you've engaged the employee, but they actually start in that interview process. So they're important to be aware of. Those laws that apply, again, are Title VII, which addresses prohibitions against race, sex, gender, gender identity, pregnancy, and religion discrimination. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, and again, in Oklahoma, we have the Oklahoma Anti-Discrimination Act, which also addresses these same protected categories. When you have candidates, again, make sure you've got that position description there. We do suggest often that you get multiple candidates for your pool, at least 2 or 3, so you have somebody to compare to say, yes, I got the best candidate. And then ask yourself, how do they look on your paper? What's their resume like? What kind of a letter did they write to you? How did they present themselves? And then how did they interact with the interviewers? Were they able to tell you what their career goals are? Questions and comments that are unnecessary to work performance and that way are unnecessary to interview process are questions about age, questions about gender, questions about race, questions about religion, questions about disability status, unless you have an absolute obvious disability that you might need to accommodate for. Questions about vaccination status aren't necessary at that point in time. You don't need to know genetic information. You don't need to know family planning or marital status at that point in time. Salary history is one that you really don't need to know and is a red button for a potential discrimination claim, because if somebody was underpaid in their prior job, that could have you committing some issues with underpaying them for you. So we say leave those alone. Obviously, vulgar language and yelling are not appropriate for an employee interview. So these are kind of the what not to do. But what you should do during an interview is focus on that position description and can that employee do the job that you have in front of them? If you focus on work performance, that should help you with 99% of your issues in the workplace. One thing we are careful of and watching out for is not making oral promises when you're in an interview, because somebody might hold you to that later and try to. So don't make promises. Look at that position description. Look at what salary ranges you have available for those positions and check what those are without making promises, because sometimes those get enforced in the workplace. Beyond skills, determining how the candidate fits into the mission of your employment arrangement. What is your business mission? I hope you have that goal before you're there. What does it look like to fit into it? It should be very work focused and product driven or service driven. Ask yourselves, how does your mission benefit from diversity of opinions, from diversity of race, from diversity of age, gender, etc.? Those all help in the workplace. If your mission's using questions based upon protected classes and or status to answer those questions, we're going to ask you to stop, take a breath, reassess, and take yourself back to the real work-related positions so that you aren't discriminating against an employee in their interview process. Revoking an offer in the workplace is actually a really rare event. Most of the time, you should know your candidate from the interview process. Then you make a contingent offer. That offer is contingent on a background check, and that can include both a criminal background check and sometimes, depending on the position, a financial background check as well. So you may look at that and then ask yourself, are you going to revoke the offer? The first thing to look back to is that position description. Does the issue that I'm looking at, perhaps in a background check, really affect that position or not? Because you really want it to be related to the actual work that's going to be done. Did you find out in reviewing a background check that somebody falsified their application or their reference information or their resume? That would be a red flag where I would be looking at potentially revoking an offer. Did you really truly have an unexpected position change? All of a sudden you lost your market, for example, a restaurant in March of 2020 during COVID, where you're revoking an offer because you just don't have the need for the employment. That would be a situation where you might revoke an offer. Background check results, again, criminal and credit issues, you're going to focus on, does that actual issue affect my employment? For example, you're not going to have a sex offender working in a school with children. That would be an example where you would revoke, but they might be able to work in a different field. So make sure that you're focused on the ability to perform the work. Failed drug tests are often a reason that we might look at revoking an offer, but you would also ask yourself, is there another issue that I have to look at under the Americans with Disabilities Act or not? And then bad reference checks. And again, if somebody gave a reference that was maybe a false reference, that's falsification in that business. You might look at that as somewhere where you're going to revoke an offer. But again, it is the exception to the rule. So you should be putting yourself on more of a heightened review when you're asking yourself, why am I revoking this offer? Did what I learned really affect their interview or the position itself? So with that, we'll turn to our second section, which is onboarding best practices. And those are, hopefully, if you are a small business employer, you still have some rules for your business, things you expect your employees to abide by. It might be a short handbook, just your major basic rules. If you're a really small employer, larger the employer, the more rules they're going to have in a handbook or detailed policies and procedures. Or they might even have handbooks that are done because of regulations specific to particular industries. Did you get your handbook legally reviewed? When's the last time you did get your handbook legally reviewed to make sure that you're keeping up with the laws that are almost always moving and changing? And did you obtain signed acknowledgments from the employee? So again, they're acknowledging those expectations for their position at the front end, so that if you have an issue at the back end, you can say, see, you knew, you signed, you saw this handbook. With that, we'll turn to sort of engaging people in the workplace. And again, I can't stress enough that that starts engagement with that position description so that they know what they're supposed to be doing. We've looked at the golden rules of kind of handling issues and the performance issues. Handle issues timely, but thoughtfully. So don't be afraid to take that breath when you have an issue come up, and maybe find the policy that you think they're violating or the practice and procedures that you think they're violating, and handle it respectfully. Kind of follow the golden rule. How would I expect someone to treat my son, daughter, mother, child, cousin if the same issue came up? And then if you have the ability to have those resources, go find a human resources professional and or a lawyer when you spot an issue that rises to that level. So don't be afraid to sort of take a break and raise your hand and say, I need more help or more information. Knowing and appreciating the audience of your employees and sometimes their families is important. We've been looking a lot in our practice at generational stereotypes in the workplace, because in the end, how you managed an employee who is, you know, of the baby boomer generation versus Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, et cetera, can be different. And in the end, once you've invested all your time in interviewing, onboarding, doing a background check for an employee, you want to focus on what you can to get the best kind of work product you can out of your employees. So we are going to provide some resources for that, but make sure that they know your corporate vision so that they're in there. Focus on when you do need to make a policy change or adaptation, whether it's as an accommodation for some of the laws we're going to focus on a little earlier, or as something that's just no longer working for your workplace. You know, focusing on increasing social responsibility is important to a lot of the workers we see coming into the workforce now. You know, what do you have as a resource to close the gaps between formal education and competencies for the job? Because once you've onboarded someone, it's probably worth your while to make sure that you're providing resources to make sure they can do the job you can. And then supporting employees with wellness and resilience, because we want to make sure that they're there. And we're seeing a lot of these employees are really focused on those types of issues in the workplace now. Then the third section, which is probably is our most important section in the end, if we haven't done the work on the front end of engaging them, is performance management. So here we're going to focus on several of the laws that apply to your existing employees and your recruits. But again, focus on getting the most out of your employees. And the most important thing we can say is communicate with your employees about what their performance goals are, what your company objectives are, and how to offer feedback in the workplace. Utilize performance management software if appropriate. If you're a small business, you may not have a lot to invest in that, but there may be some shortcuts that you can find in managing employees that are helped by utilizing performance management software. Anymore, you can see, for example, like a lot of software that's easily available that'll help people clock time in and out or communicate with you. Make sure that your language is language that your employees are understanding so that they have those job expectations for you. The laws that apply to performance issues are the same as those laws that apply to interviews, but we're going to address those a little bit more in detail now. First, Title VII, which if you have enough employees will apply, addresses race, sex, gender, gender identity, pregnancy, and religion. So protected characteristics under those, you'll want to make sure that you are managing the performance based on the actual work, not based on someone's race, not based on their sex, gender, gender identity, not because of their religion, pregnancy, or because of their religion. Then under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're going to want to focus on is if an employee raises an issue and says, hey, I'm having a little problem in the workplace getting my job done, the first question to ask is, how can I help you? And if they provide a reasonable solution that's affordable and cost effective, then we might want to look at that. That might be something from providing somebody with the right desk chair or a standing desk. It's not providing glasses or hearing aids because those are personal use items that apply outside the workplace, but it might be something that you have to accommodate. Under Title VII, you might have to accommodate a religious issue. For example, if someone says, I need to take time out to pray today, and we may have to look at, do we need to provide that accommodation? And if it's not an undue hardship on employers, then we need to do that. Is it reasonable? If it's just 5 minutes out of the workplace, that's no difference than taking a break to walk around the block. So we want to look at whether an accommodation is reasonable or not. Then the other major law that we look at in the workplace is age, to make sure that you're not discriminating against somebody based on their age. With respect to the age claims, well, good question to ask yourself is there something I can do to help an employer in the workplace have more access to a work tool like social media or a software? Maybe is there some training that I need to give to help that person jump there? Then with respect to employment law, we look at where can things go wrong? And so there's a few key definitions for you. Things can go wrong when you're treating somebody differently based upon their protected characteristic. So if I have 2 employees that I'm managing to a policy, am I treating them differently just because of their race or their gender or their religion or because they're pregnant? That's considered disparate treatment if I'm treating them differently under a policy. And it's a red flag that you should be asking yourself, because you should be asking, how can I get the same level of work out of my employees? What is my work expectation? The other definitions that we want to look at is adverse action. Is something really affecting the working conditions of that employee, whether it's in their job benefits or getting discharged or suspended, or whether we move them to an office location that's less desired, et cetera. Some of those things can be considered adverse action. So you're going to want to ask yourself, am I materially affecting the workplace for this employee based upon a protected status? And then the third major issue that we look at in the workforce is retaliation. Am I handling something with an employee because they raised an appropriate discrimination issue? If an employee came to me and said, hey, I'm being treated unfairly under this policy, and my non-protected coworker is not being treated differently, they might have engaged in a protected activity, and you're going to want to watch that you're not retaliating against them with the next action. For example, am I firing someone just after they complained about discrimination? You're going to want to ask yourself, or am I really firing them because their work product has been poor for the last 6 to 9 months, and I've tried to coach them through those issues? So ask yourself those issues when you're going through. Then the other thing we look at is there a hostile work environment? Has the work environment been so permeated with discriminatory, intimidation, ridicule, or insult that that person really is not working in the same condition that we would like them to and that we hired them to? Did it create an abusive working environment based on a protected status under the law? Race, age, gender, gender identity, pregnancy, religion, etc. Because not all hostile work environment is covered by one of these laws. It's not a best practice to have a hostile work environment, but some of those don't violate the law. So you're going to want to ask yourself, when does it violate the law and when doesn't it? Harassment. Hopefully most of your managers are aware that harassment is unwelcome conduct based upon a protected status. It's sufficiently severe or pervasive that it's altering employment conditions. And sometimes that can be just one event depending on what was said or what was done. And then does it have a basis for employee liability? Sometimes things happen in the workplace where somebody says something, tells an off-color joke based upon a protected status. It might be found to be a stray remark. Never a best practice in the workplace, but those are kind of the legal levels that we all look at as lawyers when we're doing cases. So you'd have to ask yourself, an employer, was this discrimination? Was it a stray remark that I will want to address anyway because it's not what I desire for my workplace? Then again, we look at whether these laws apply because it's someone who's in a protected class. Are they 40 or older? So the Age Act applies. Are they, for example, pregnant? Am I treating them differently because of their pregnancy? Is it their religion? Is it race? Is it color, ethnicity, genetic background? Again, under those retaliation claims, we're going to ask yourself to ask before you manage an employee in the workplace, am I focused on work or am I retaliating? Did that person complain about discrimination? Did that person say, hey, I'm going to go file a charge of discrimination? Were they picketing in opposition to discrimination or a labor practice? Were they refusing to obey an order that's reasonably believed to be discriminatory? Were they requesting leave? Are there actions that are interfering with job performance that are rendering the employee ineffective? So ask yourself before you're managing an employee to an issue, did they just engage in protected activity? I should be on heightened awareness to make sure I'm focused on, is this issue really a discrimination issue? Or is this issue a work performance issue that I can better handle in the workplace? Again, focusing on the actual work product and the position description and those essential functions should allow you to do your job of managing employees. We again will tell you all to focus on looking at, is this harassment? Am I cutting off jokes, that are inappropriate in the workplace? If I'm a supervisor and I'm aware of them, I want to nip those in the bud. Because supervisors and employers have defenses to harassment. Hey, the minute I heard about it, I exercised reasonable care to prevent it again. Maybe I wrote someone up. Maybe it was so bad that I had to terminate the offending employee, but I, as an employer, am taking care of that. So early notice of those issues and intervention by the companies can be defenses to some of these workplace allegations. So again, Title VII applies early. It happens in recruiting and through your workplace. Just be unaware, is this action because of work or is it really because of somebody's protected characteristics? Pregnancy and caregiver discrimination, we look at those a lot in the law because we want to make sure, am I not hiring someone because they were pregnant and I didn't think they could do the job? Then I might be making an assumption that's wrong. Or did I not hire someone because they had 5 kids at home and I assumed they couldn't arrange for childcare? We want to avoid that kind of discrimination and just focus on, is this employee showing up? Have they told me they're going to show up and do their job, and focus on the work? Religious discrimination under Title VII is one of the Title VII issues where, again, you might have to make an accommodation. So you don't have to know all the answers on these. What you do have to know is if somebody's asking for something special because of their religion under Title VII or the Oklahoma Anti-Discrimination Act, you'll need to ask yourself, do I need to make a reasonable accommodation for this? What is a reasonable accommodation? And you can have a conversation with the employee about what it is they think they need and what might actually work, because it does have to be reasonable for the employer to offer that accommodation. Then the Age Discrimination with Employment Act, again, ask yourself, am I screening out candidates maybe because of their age, or am making assumptions based on age? Because I should drop those assumptions and really focus on, can you do the job at hand that's in the position description? Then again, a key one that we're seeing a lot in the workplace right now is people focused on the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's going to get triggered by some simple questions when someone says, hey, I can't do my job because maybe I need a stool to sit on during the day, or I might need some extra leave. An easy answer to the person when they ask for that is to say, well, what is it you're looking at? What do you think would help you? Let me think about that and I'll get back to you, so that you're not discriminating against an individual that has a disability. And a disability is defined as a person who has a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one of major life activities like walking, talking, singing, smelling can be one now that's coming up a little bit with COVID, has a record of such an impairment. In other words, did you know that they had a history of perhaps having cancer in the background, or you've treated them as having an impairment, so you've actually qualified them to be an individual with a disability under the ADA because perhaps you made some wrong assumptions about whether somebody can do their job or not. One thing we'll caution you with respect to the ADA and any leave issues is to make sure that you're addressing confidentiality, keeping those medical issues in separate files from your regular performance-based issues if there's any kind of medical or leave-related issues in there. Another law that comes up in the workplace is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. You don't have to know what it is. You do need to know what it does. It prohibits you from using a person's genetic information to determine eligibility for premiums or to determine eligibility for a job. So that's asking about maybe somebody's family background history. It could be making the assumption that someone whose parent is bipolar themselves. That could possibly violate the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Again, if you hear special things in the workplace, that's when to raise your hand, dig in, do a little more research, and seek out your HR professionals. Then, even if none of the federal laws apply because you don't have enough employees, perhaps you're super small, you might be subject to the Oklahoma Anti-Discrimination Act, and it covers all the federal laws that we've just discussed, which are discriminating in the employment on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, religion, creed, disability, or genetic information. And those, again, can get triggered from leave issues as well. So leaves of absence, we're going to talk about those a little bit. Creating a clear policy for employee leave. You're going to need that so that you can address attendance later. Just make sure your employees know what those clear policies are. I don't know that for those of you that are small employers, the Family Medical Leave Act will apply. It is for employers that have 50 employees in a 75-mile radius. The employee must have been employed for 12 months. It may or may not apply to you, but when someone's asking about leave, ask yourself, is there coverage of the employer under the act? And is the employee covered in the act? If somebody's going to be out for more than 3 days and the employer's covered, you're going to ask yourself, do I need to give them Leave Act documents? Another place we look in the workplace to ask yourself, and this can happen again from candidacy to through the end, is this person a military member under USERRA, which is the Uniformed Service Act? Do I need to help that person become qualified to perform that job? So if you hear anything about military, raise your hand, do a little research on USERRA to see if they might either need something special for doing their job or for returning to their job or being employed in the first place. The last major area we'll talk about is wage and hour issues, making sure that you're paying the correct federal or state minimum wage. Make sure that you've classified employees if they're overtime eligible and that you're paying that overtime as required. We've provided some links. There's some good information on www.dol.gov, and also the Oklahoma labor issues are on www.ok.gov. So look at your classifications for wage and hour to make sure you're paying people correctly. That's even more important in this day and age when we're dealing with a lot of electronics and our workday may have blended, and also when you're dealing with remote issues. We've provided some IRS guidelines for you in the spreadsheet if you need to know more information about that. And the Oklahoma.gov website also has a great wage and hour booklet that's fairly simple to read. I would suggest all small employers read that, particularly if you're going to have younger people, 16-year-olds and above, working for you in your workplace. Managing performance challenges. The best thing I can tell you is if you have a workplace issue, go in, pull up your policy and your position description that are applicable and see if they're actually doing the work. So pull those documents that you created early on and check and see where that policy violation is and write it up, focusing on those issues as they occur rather than letting yourself as an employer get to the end of your rope is a good idea. So handle them early, handle them often, and document. If all else fails, you may have to terminate an employee. You should have a record of that with the position description, the policy they violated, and your documentation. You're small employers that are kind of the target of this presentation, but you might ask yourself, does the WARN Act apply if I have to close down my whole business? What do I have to do? What laws apply if I have to close up shop to do those? Ask yourself about timing for terminations. Should I do it on location or remotely? Always focus on workplace safety for the rest of the people when you're terminating employees, and whether you have benefits that might help that outgoing employee with mental health or placement assistance. And then finally, just a little blast on confidentiality and privacy that we addressed before, but make sure that you're keeping medical files separate from your performance files and that you do keep your employee files confidential. With that, we have a list of resources here that are available. There's a long list here that's employment law by the numbers, but I'm going to focus again on the key ones that you might be able to go to. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a great resource for small employers to check to make sure they're not discriminating. The Department of Labor has good bulletins at www.dol.gov that'll help you with your wage and hour classifications and your workplace safety classifications as well. OSHA also has a great website that people should be familiar with to make sure workplace safety is going on. And then again, your Oklahoma Attorney General websites and your Oklahoma Department of Labor websites. So there's obviously a variety of resources. We didn't have a whole lot of time for you today, but hopefully we gave you a lot of red flags, just when to ask yourself, do I need to stop, be thoughtful, get some resources and research so that I don't run afoul of the many, many employment laws that might apply to my employees and my business. With that, I'll turn it back to Brenda Lewis at the Tulsa Chamber.
Erica, thank you so much. You gave us a wealth of knowledge, and I believe you had your email address that if there are folks of you that wanted to reach out to her, certainly can do so. And so thank you for sharing this. We are not done. There are definitely questions that we need to recap and go over. One question, actually, I really wanted to start with, since you mentioned there's a lot of information. Do I need to know everything?
Absolutely not. That's the big question. You just need to know enough, not to know the answer, but to know those red flags. So again, we've provided a lot of the websites that you can go to as an employer, the key ones, EEOC, your local attorney general for Oklahoma, looking at your wage and hour issues, raising your hand to get a professional. You just need to know that if someone is asking for something special in the workplace, you need to go do some research on that and get some help. So you don't have to know the answers right away. And when you're talking to an employee, that's one thing I can't stress enough is be thoughtful, really listen to their issue. Don't feel like you have to give the answers right away, because you might need to go research those to make sure you're getting the employee the right answer so that you can handle those issues in the workplace.
And actually, that was going to be my next question that you touched on. Is it okay to tell an employee, I need to review this information and take a step back before I give you an answer?
It is absolutely okay. There are a few cases where I would say you might need to deal with this on a more time critical issue. And that's when if the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you say, wow, I might have a workplace safety issue. That's the one time when, if you're uncomfortable, you think the workplace might be unsafe, then you're going to need to take all the measures you might need, whether it's calling 911, whether it's calling in another professional immediately on those workplace safety issues. If ask yourself, is this an emergency? Then handle it like an emergency. Can this take a day? Can this take a week? Should this take 2 weeks? Do I need to be really thoughtful about this one? For example, if I'm doing an investigation, how much do I need to know? How long should it take? Was I thoughtful, or did I just jump the gun and make a decision really quickly that maybe I shouldn't have? So it is okay. Use your judgment. Again, ask yourself, is this an emergency? I usually say, is it an emergency? Call 911. Is it today? Let's get a team assembled. Is it this week? Is it in 2 weeks? Those are good guidelines to ask yourself on those immediate employee issues.
Those are great guidelines, especially for our smaller employers that are tuning in that may not necessarily have a guide in place right now. This is a good place to start. Speaking of information, so you mentioned for the FMLA to apply to you, you need to have 15 employees in the 25-mile radius. How many employees do you need to have for Title VII to be applicable?
Sure, yeah. Well, there are different laws, and we've got those on there. With Title VII, I'd say it doesn't really matter, but you're going to go with 15 or more for Title VII to apply. But if you've got 2 employees, you might find yourself under the same substance of the law under the Oklahoma Anti-Discrimination Act. So I would, as a small employer, not be so focused on, well, Title VII might not apply, but there's a local Oklahoma law that will apply. So even if I'm small, I need to make sure that I am following sort of the guidelines and the tenets of Title VII, even if they don't technically apply, because there's usually a state law that will, even if I'm smaller.
And there might be folks that are unfamiliar, even folks as myself, that I'm not running my own business. So it may not be something that's at the forefront of their mind. So that's really great to hear you to give that reminder. My final question actually is, what are the 3 best easy resources for help? Obviously you are one, but I'm sure there's a link that might be a little easier.
Sure, absolutely. I would start as an employer going on the Equal Opportunity Commission, www.eeoc.gov website. They have tabs that are on there that are for employers and employees. Those are really user-friendly tabs. They'll give you a snapshot of all the same laws that I just provided with you, so you can see those. I would say start there. That's a great place to start. It will give you more than you need to handle discrimination issues in the workplace. With respect to disabilities in the workplace, when you're thinking through what might be a reasonable accommodation, there's also a great website called askjan.gov. That's askjan.gov. And they'll have a situation that says, I have an employee with diabetes. What might be an accommodation there? And they'll have really good guidance about what is a reasonable accommodation for that and good ideas. The other resource for disabilities in the workplace, I would say, is to ask your employee what it is you need, because they might be a resource too. They might give you a pie in the sky answer that is not reasonable, but they might give you a really creative one too. So see that. Then again, with workplace wage and hour issues, I would definitely go to www.dol.gov. That's the Department of Labor. They will help you recognize some red flags. They have some online, even interactive guidelines that you can run through when you have a situation if you're trying to figure out how to pay someone correctly, because payroll issues are one we just all want to avoid in the workplace. So they've got some good resources there. OSHA is a great resource for workplace safety. You're a small business, but you might be subject to making sure your workplace is there. So if you're dealing with chemicals, heat injuries are a hot topic for OSHA right now. So you might look at OSHA. Obviously, OSHA has been handling a lot of COVID-19 issues. So they might be a little bit more well-known website now. And then again, the Oklahoma websites for the Oklahoma Attorney General and the Oklahoma Department of Labor. Those are really useful websites. So those are your top ones. You could pretty much find a good answer by going through those. And then again, if you need to seek out either an HR professional or a lawyer with respect to those issues, they're there. But those will give you some good training, just sitting down and reading through some of those so that you know where to look when you have an issue come up. But again, ask yourself, am I focused on the work? Because that question alone, if you're just focusing on the work, you're really going to get through a lot of your employment law issues.
This is excellent, excellent content. Thank you so much, Erica. And if folks are wanting the full presentation, if you wouldn't mind going to that last slide you had there with your email address, people can pause this presentation and take a screenshot, screen grab, take your phone out. So thank you for your expertise and sharing all of this information with us. And I'll have you stop sharing your screen now.
Okay.
The hook.
I will give you your screen back.
No problem. No problem. Thank you again, though, Erica, for your time now, for serving as our expert on this session of the Build program, as we mentioned, called Hiring, Firing, and Everything in Between. Again, thank you to our generous sponsors that made today possible, and to our viewers, thank you for joining us. We hope that this session provided you with knowledge and insight to better support your small business now and in the future. Please check out future segments of the Build program on our website or on our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time. Thank you.